Hello, I am going to make a little recording here just in case it might help somebody who's currently in the US and wondering what on earth to do if because I know that some people are really worried about what's happening at the moment. I'm in doing a master's, and one of my modules at the moment is about extremism and the rise of the far right. So I've been looking at this issue, and it's an opportunity for me maybe to share a little bit of the studying and learning around this to perhaps help people to understand how did this happen, what's happening now, and what to do about it. So the current situation with Trump and Musk and big money in the US at the minute is something that didn't all come from Trump. It started back before that. We need to see where did this come from, and we need to look back. We're looking back now even at 2014. At that stage, the Republican Party, studies, this is from the Pew Research Center, were showing uh, that there was a real desire for the Republican Party to move in a more conservative direction. They wanted to get, more conservative, and they wanted more religion in public life. They were feeling a sense of threat to their values and their traditions and to religious life. They was a growing percentage who wanted more border security, and they were a very small number, who were actually confident about that their votes would actually be counted in an election. Now, when we look at the studies of the rise of the far right, across the world, and people who have studied this, what we can see is that the far right will hijack and use any insecurities, economic, insecurities or securities where people worried about losing their traditional values or their traditional life or their religious life. These people will come in and really use that. Now, the insecurities may have grown as a result of neoliberalism and globalization and even in the UK austerity, but it's using that, maybe some places you see that they use it like when they say that there's a shortage of housing or, issues with healthcare that pre-existed, that they will use that to try to, for their own political objectives, aggravating those worries for their objectives. And they're very disapproving of immigration and multiculturalism. They really divide people and they instill fear and hatred. And you see that people will vote for the far right because of their worries and about established parties maybe being more liberal and inclusive and having more equality and freedom. We can see an example of this exploiting fears when we just talked right now about the worry that only 35% of people thought that they would their votes would be counted accurately. That was really exploited by Trump when he on January 6th and back in 2021 when he made this tweet, and he basically said that the election was stolen, and he said, if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore. This resulted in 2,000 people entering, the Capitol building, and if 5 people died within 36 hours of that. 5 people had died, and then there was many people injured, including 174 police officers. This really spilled to violence. This exploitation of fears and worries and this false narrative, and using that to then it resulted in violence. So we need to not forget that. It's very important not to forget that this turned to violence very quickly. And then the people who were responsible for that violence have been granted clemency since Trump has got into power. So this is now you know, for it to spill to violence like that, you need to dehumanize people. So it becomes a very much thing about sectarian. So there's us and there's them. So people get really divided and lose sight of themselves and lose sight of other people and as humans, and they dehumanize them. And it becomes that, there's this higher us, that are they're better, than other people and them, and it just becomes a very divided country. And I think you can see that happening now in the US. And that's setting up for extremism. And it becomes a very high risk situation because there will be always a potential for a small number of people to think that violence is the only way here. Looking back further in history, we can see back in 1927, Fred Trump, Donald Trump's father, was arrested when he was part of a march at that stage. The KKK were marching, and he was arrested on that day. And we don't know exactly where he was or exactly his role in that, and he wasn't charged, but he was arrested that day. And we know that they were out trying to get one American, Protestant Americans were wanting one school, one public school, one English language. And they were these, as they called, native born Protestant Americans. So, like, this is this higher level, of supreme people, supreme white people, Protestant people that were somehow above other people. And this is a very dangerous way of thinking. And yet in 2025, when Donald Trump came in, one of the first things that he did was designate English as the official language, and the Spanish language version, was for administration, was taken off the White House website. These are the kind of examples that we need to just keep in mind. So, it's susceptibility to sectarianism. It really comes from communal fears and grievances. There's this emotional, psychological, and ideological, social, and sociological factors that make people susceptible. If they could fear that they're losing, maybe their religious traditions, maybe their chance to for self-realizations in what is now a neoliberal world, but that neoliberal world is caused by, the interests of big business being served, concerns over their identity and belonging, where do this traditional Christians, belong in the world now if it's changing. And an expert in counterterrorism from MI5 talked about historical attention span deficit disorder. And I think probably one of the most important things for the US at the moment is to step back and look at examples of where the things that are happening now happened before in history and it didn't end well. So these need to be remembered. So what we're seeing now is the top concern in the US, top of the list of the concerns for economic issues and people's concern is the role of big money in politics. Okay, that's number one. 72% are really concerned about that. That's even above affordability of healthcare, which is very serious situation in the US because it's been privatized, and the corporations are taking millions out of that. As we're in the UK at the moment trying to hold on to our NHS and protect it from privatization because we're feeling corporate interests creeping into that and creating deep inequality as a result and leaving people more vulnerable as a result. But this top role of money in politics is number one in the US at the moment. So we see that this role of money has seemed to have this corporate capitalism seems to have formed a really strong alliance with anti-liberal Christian clergy. Now, it works studies on this show that extreme conservatives view real America as Christian, and the government, if it serves diversity and equality, that's evil. If that government is in power at the time, and they are in opposition to multiracial democracy. So this anti-abortion movement, it became rooted in this culture war in supporting anti-gay legislation, gun rights, opposition to equal rights amendments, and limitations on voting rights. So this money and this fundamentalism seem to have come and got married together to be able to, to be against equality and liberal freedoms. And this is being described as an authoritarian project. So this is what's been written by academics at the moment, that we need to flag up as warning bells for people in the US. But to look a little bit at neoliberal ideology, so which seems to have now got very close to the very strong religious beliefs and the churches in the US at the moment, especially the evangelical movement. This is this is an ideology where the market rules, where corporate power and wealth really manipulate fears and racism now for profit. The government want to, as they call it, starve the beast of government, current government. And they want to cut regulations on private businesses. And they also want to cut taxes on for big businesses. The idea always, this neoliberalism was sold, this market ideology was always sold as like, if we really make rich people richer and we make corporations stronger and we grow all this like that, that somehow, there'll be a trickle down from their wealth to the rest of society, and that will somehow benefit people. But that was false, and that's been proven to be false. Okay, so it's an assault on welfare. They just blame people. They don't consider, some people are privileged and other people are not privileged, and people have a lot more challenges, and there's no consideration of that. It's just blame people if they need support, in the system. It's engineered inequality, deindustrialization, and removing the status of unions. It seems like there are many people who are now indifferent to human rights, social justice, and civil liberties. It's certainly the market and the corporate power and wealth are not interested in human rights, social justice, and civil liberties. That's not their role. Their role is to make private profit and to grow private profit. Their interest is greed, and that is their values. It doesn't reflect the values of people. Maybe we should put some good news into this. The good news is that if you look at a website, resource called the Common Cause Foundation in the UK, that you will see that around 75% of people share values that they care about social and environmental justice, that people do care. That is the reflection that we are hardwired as human beings. We are compassionate. We have humanity. That's who people are. There is a small percentage who are interested in greed and exploiting and just looking after themselves and their own interests. And that's a small percentage, but it's not the majority of people. But so it's important to remember that that this is not reflecting, doesn't reflect our values. So we have an education system as well that is described as nativist, they see as native and infused with Christian nationalism. That is a problem because we need it to be inclusive and we need it to be helping people to be free. And Paulo Freire talked about how important it was to not have a banking education system, that we didn't have a system where people were just told this is how it is, and that's it. You teach people this, and you don't allow dialogue or questioning or problem solving or anything like that to happen. It is just this is how it is, and that's it. No questioning. So this woke label has been applied now, and it's really just like freedom for some, and it's limiting electoral access and voting access. It's anti-gay rights and anti-LGBT. It's public school book bans. It's opposition to academic freedom. It's restricting abortion rights. It's opposition to transgender. It's deceptively, it's deporting and incarcerating immigrants. It's opposition to Black Lives Matters, and it's pro-gun and supporting, the carry laws for guns. And this is important to call all this out because we have to see the warning signs from history. We have to see that this is not freedom for people. This is freedom for some. And as this quote from the Frameworks Institute talks about, it's your freedom does not supersede somebody else's freedom. So we need to just be very aware of what's happening here and how serious this situation is. Fundamental to democracy is being able to peacefully assemble and to peacefully have a protest. And Donald Trump is just stopping universities now actually having what he terms illegal protests. And the people will be in prisons, or students will be permanently expelled. So this is a real regression. Repression is any idealized or threatened limit or coercive action taken by state authorities to control or prevent challenges that could alter the status quo or the distribution of power. Okay, so this is a very serious situation that, and again, talking about the need for education, to be for domestication and not liberation. And it's enshrined within the Constitution, the First Amendment: the Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting free exercise thereof or bridging the freedom of speech or press, or the right of people to peacefully assemble. That's been taken away now, and that should be a really serious warning sign to everybody in the US at the moment. Looking at the push and pull to violent extremism, people who become terrorists see themselves as virtuous, altruistic, and moral and righteous. But actually, genuine morality and integrity is actually quite urgent at the moment to counter this. And, we need to be reducing injustice and countering, the reservoirs of support in this. But we need to be, looking at the interwovenness of the past, the present, and the future. Far-right values are white supremacy, masculinity, social conservatism, nationalism, and militarism. That is historically, and what we know from studies around this. And we need to be aware of the complexity of online spaces and social networks, and how this is really strengthening real world organizing, for them, for the far right, that networking, the activism, the far right ecosystem, those online communities where they, make friends, share rage, memes, fears, they get emotional support, they cheer on, and apparently plan how to red pill family members. What's red pill, you might ask? It is an ideology of male supremacy, neoconservative, and is misogynistic. Another phrase that comes up in studies is something called white thymus, and this is the emotional states of radicalized pride, rage, and anger generated in online digital affective circuits, creating a perception of loss of white entitlement. You know, um, the drivers of violent extremism, there are both individual motivations and there are conditions that are conducive to that. It could be, whatever individual factors, could be adolescent crisis, it could be, a sense of mission and heroism that's being invoked, a promise of adventure and power, attraction of violence. It could be, collective grievances, the narrative of victimization that provoke emotional responses, and which allow people to be manipulated by charismatic leaders. The distortion and misuse of belief, political ideologies, and ethnic and cultural differences. Simple worldviews of us versus them. And the attraction of charismatic leadership and social communities and networks, charismatic recruiter providing access to power and money, a sense of belonging to a powerful group and community. These are real pull factors in driving violent extremism and that people need to be aware of. Push factors that could, we've talked about some of those already, particularly unique to the US and evangelical churches in the US, and them feeling threatened and their values feeling threatened, in the changing world. Can also be socioeconomic opportunities. It can be marginalization, injustices, poor governance, violations of human rights and the rule of law. They may see that this is offering them, an opportunity. The radicalization process in prisons, prolonged and unresolved conflicts, lots of push and pull factors driving people into violent extremism. We're coming to a place where we're going to talk about what to do, but we'll just have another look here at a 2025 survey done in 27th of February by the Pew Research resource, where you can look up and see what's happening according to the people in the US and what they feel. And this is about the percentage of adults who say, what's happening with Donald Trump taking office, who's going to gain influence. People in the US are very clear that the people who are going to gain influence are big corporations, wealthy people, white people, men, the military, and evangelical Christians. That's who is gaining influence in the US, according to people. That's who Americans feel are gaining influence here. And the people who are losing influence are like older people, children, women, poor people, unions, Black people, Hispanic people, gay and lesbian people, transgender people. And actually, people like yourself, people feel that ordinary people are losing influence, but the people who are gaining influence are big business. And we talked about neoliberalism, and what they're interested in is profit and making money, not actually caring about, all of the people here on this side of the graph who are losing influence. So that's a very serious situation, and it's very starkly laid out in that particular survey data. So the question is about who's in control, and whose values and whose interests. And when you see cuts to Medicaid and Medicare and Social Security, and you see higher prices on basic goods because of the tariff wars that are now ensuing, and tax cuts that benefit especially the wealthy in the top 1%, and people, the Democrats and Republicans are seeing this differently. The Republicans are seeing that the military will gain influence most of all, and big corporations, and both sides see this. The Democrats also see this, that big corporations are going to gain influence now, and white people, and there's a shared view here across both Democrats and Republicans about who is gaining influence and who's losing influence. It's quite that. Yes, the Republicans don't seem to recognize that, you know, poor people, children, older people, women, all of these things are, there's a lot of, you know, even right down to guys, they're losing influence. But there's definitely a strong correlation between both Democrats and Republicans, that the military, big business, white people, men, and evangelical Christians, they're the top, and wealthy people are now more in control. So that's something that people have in common. And that's important. That's very important at the moment, to see that this is something that are shared concerns and common concerns, because it's very important right now to find common ground and to recognize what happens whenever you have that particular grouping of corporations and, business people and wealthy people in control, because their interests and values are not the same as ordinary people. And in a democratic society, policy, laws, decisions, guidance, everything should be on the basis of the public interest and not of the interests of big corporations. And this is having an influence around the world. What happens in America is affecting worldwide. It's affecting climate change. It's just vast, economic stability, peace in the world, everything. Waking up to the reality of who's in control here and whose values and interests are being served here, and whether they care about human rights, sustainability of the future, and how did this happen, is everybody's concern in the world, and everybody should be concerned about this at the moment, the world. But recognizing the common ground here is also very important. So what's going to happen? What can people do? I think, given the fact that this has already spilled over to violence in the past, and there's a history of the extreme right and issues like this leading to violence and harm, it's important to look towards the work of John Paul Lederach first. And his work as a peace builder shows that everybody has a role. There's a role for the grassroots. There's a role for what he terms in the middle range, humanitarian leaders, academics, intellectual, religious leaders, NGOs, all of that in the middle range. And there's a role at the top for, negotiating and bringing peace and pulling this back into a situation where the public interest is served, not the interests of big corporations and particular groups. So we can look a little bit at what community resilience might entail right now. Community resilience starts in the community, and it starts with individuals. And it's being mindful of what is happening now and realizing that the issue is a them and us sectarian extremism that dehumanizes, and the need to rehumanize people and to bring people back together on their common cause, which is clear there in previous slides. So we need to return to empathy and compassion and listening skills, and those need to be developed rapidly in this situation. We need to be able to see other viewpoints and listen and talk to people we don't agree with. And we need evidence of facts, a little bit of which we've looked at today. We need to be able to have respectful dialogue, listening, challenging prejudice, in order to try to give people more confidence in making healthy choices in this situation. We need to be able to understand framing and narrative constructions, and being able to recognize whenever words that are said, things may not be true. And we need a tolerance that is for human rights and peace, and not tolerating the intolerant. So not the intolerant being tolerated. That's a bit of a tongue twister, isn't it? Um, we can't tolerate the intolerant, and we shouldn't tolerate the intolerant. We need tolerance, human rights, and peace. And we need to support people who are at risk of marginalization or discrimination. We need to recognize exploitation and how some people are preying on the insecurities of the people, who are maybe in religious groupings, and fearful and feeling a sense of loss because of change, because of neoliberalism, and how, the current path is not going to end well. We need fact-checking moderators, making online safe. There's a need for change in that area. Strengthening liberal democracy, promotion of positive political alternatives. And there are alternatives, and it's very important for people to talk about the alternatives in a different way that would be a better way for the future of democracy, which is crucial. And to be able to listen to and reflect the shared concerns of people, because there are, as we can see, shared concerns. New evidence, new studies just this year have new work has been done about countering violent polarization at local and regional levels through restorative justice. And there's great resources for all of this online, for developing empathy, for listening, for peace building. John Paul Laderak's work, we need to steep ourselves in that. But the European Forum for Restorative Justice has plenty to offer in ways of countering and offsetting violent narratives through restorative ones. And this is what's happening as a consequence for all of society in the US and even farther afield at the moment. But it's about the people who are suffering as a result of that, and their voice being heard, and because who are victims in that, victims of marginalization and discrimination in this. And it is about them being seen and felt as a real person and being rehumanized, because the mechanisms at the moment are for selective moral disengagement. And it becomes very difficult to apply that whenever people are actually telling their personal stories of how this is making them feel and what's happening. And, we need to be, we need to be building every opportunity to rehumanize, and we need to be guided by core values of truth and dialogue. Paulo Freire wrote a book called Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and it's about education for liberation and freedom. And it discusses, how to challenge sectarianism, which he views as like a type of, like, it's an arrogance that's uncritical. It doesn't think, doesn't question. It's just like, this is the way, and it is a very dangerous mindset. And we need to move from that to common cause networks. We need to be challenging this education system that really is just serving, to be controlled for market, it's a typical of neoliberal work. Henry Giraud on YouTube and his books on neoliberalism in higher education will explain how the education system, which, as you can see now, isn't allowed to have an assembly or a protest at a university, which should be places, universities should be centers where people can come together, think and talk, as well as every, hall in the local community should be places where people can come to talk. Just that they have a lot of resources in that particular area. So, we need radical education for liberation, and young people should be reading Pedagogy of the Oppressed and neoliberalism in higher education, and should be, making democracy work and recognizing what's actually going on. We need to create safe spaces for critical thinking and communication and problem posing dialogue, where we're actually able to say, here's the problem, and we're going to talk about this. And we need to be talking about conscientization of the masses. So, people can feel at this stage very hopeless, and they can feel, what are we going to do? And they can really despair. This is not the time to despair. This is the time to organize and to educate and to resource and to mobilize and to come together. And everybody can do something, even if it's having a conversation with somebody that you don't agree with. It's about rehumanizing people, okay? And not allowing this huge division to come between people. And, so people can move from this thinking where they're just like feel there's nothing they can do, they're absolutely hopeless, to seeing this as a structural and seeing it for what it is and seeing the decisions for what they are. And, then thinking there is an alternative. Here's a better way to look after everybody and for people to reconnect and live into their values and have the public interest and not corporate interest at the start, at the heart of decision making. So we need to understand othering and dehumanizing that leads to violence, that has the potential to lead to violence. Conflict resolution skills become very important. There's so much online about that, about, building empathy and, building listening and wholehearted leadership and belonging. Brené Brown's website, brenebrown.com, tremendous resource at this time, about, talking about belonging and how we belong and how our sense of identity and how we define ourselves. It belongs to us, and it isn't up for somebody else to define that. But it's about us living in a more human and caring and compassionate and creating that better future, because I think we need to have people to come together and have a vision for the future. What do they want? Is what's happening in the US at the moment, and this power of big money and policy and decisions and everything being made in the interests of big business or the public interest. What do people want? They need to be having these conversations now. We need to realize that we're in a post-truth world, that what's been said is online is often not true. And we can look back to the work of a woman called Hannah Ardrent. I'm going to spell her name because I'm famously really bad at pronouncing it. It's Arendт. I'm open to suggestions as to how to pronounce that. But her work is, from the rise of totalitarianism in Europe. I mean, just look at her profile, a tremendously interesting life. But, she is, has written quite a bit, over the decades. And this is about learning from the past again, about, where do you find truth? At a time like this, truth is when you come together as people and sit down together and, talk together, and believe yourselves and hold the truth in your own communities. Living in a post-truth age with fake news, disinformation, and clickbait social media manipulation. We need to realize that's where people are at right now, and we need strategies to be able to come together and decide how we're going to deal with this. And again, holding on to the core values of who people are. Community education for cooperation and a grassroots vision for the future. Constructive, inclusive, peaceful solutions to challenges, and reinstall future procedures for truth and transparency. It can be done, and this is what people need to be making sure happens now, so that this situation doesn't go any deeper into despairing situation and division, but that people need to say this is what we need. Americans are 62% Christian and 7% other religions. That's 69%. And this according to a study by Mr. English in 2023. And he is an expert in counterterrorism and extreme right. And he states that, governments and states should think, organizations and communities at this stage, think creatively about the resources that exist in a society, such as those inherent in religious beliefs and practice and those involved in civil resistance. The teachings of Christianity are love, compassion, empathy, and truth. So, like our values for humanity and caring and everything. These are things that, again, like we have in those other graphs, like that, things that people have in common. And we need to go back to that quite quickly. A little graph here about hope in alternatives, right? So there is work, a lot of work in how things could and should be. Having laws that protect individual freedoms, free society, civil liberties, protecting minorities from majorities, democratic values, human freedom, listening and work together in common cause, benefiting from sharing ideas, cultures, and information. It seems very sensible and normal, but it's slipping away very rapidly, and it's becoming a very dangerous situation at the moment. So we need to remember how things could be and what the alternative should be and how we can work back to that. Finally, just going to put this slide up here, which has some references on it, some books that people might be interested in looking at, and more work that they can access, and some of the references for this piece of work. And I'll leave that there, and you can pause and screenshot it. But thank you very much for listening to this. And I hope that maybe there's something that I said that might help to sort of like build a little bit of awareness and bring people back to remember who they are, and help to think about a vision for the future and steps to actually start to rebuild, and wishing the people and the communities in the US all the very best. And yeah, start caring. Thank you.